So today is July 10, 2026, and right now, as we speak, there are exactly 147 lottery-selected runners just standing at a start line in Silverton, Colorado.
Yep, it's what, 6 a.m. Mountain Time right now?
Exactly, 6 a.m. Mountain Time. And the air there is just exceptionally thin. I mean, it's sitting at an elevation where just walking up a normal flight of stairs winds a regular person.
Oh, absolutely.
And these people are about to literally run into the San Juan Mountains.
It's just wild. For anyone tracking the actual data on this course, the raw numbers are, well, they're staggering.
Yeah, lay them out for us.
So they face 102 miles of highly technical mountain terrain. And over the course of the event, they're going to accumulate something like 33,000 feet of climbing.
Which is just absurd.
Right. And the average elevation they have to endure is over 11,000 feet. It peaks in this freezing, totally oxygen-deprived air up at Handy's Peak, which is 14,048 feet.
Unbelievable.
Yeah, and they traverse 13 different alpine passes going through Telluride, Ouray, Lake City, and the clock is just ruthless. Like, they have a strict 48-hour cutoff to get all the way back to Silverton.
And what's interesting is that 2026 happens to be a clockwise year for the course routing.
Oh, right, yeah. That changes everything.
It really does. That structural detail completely shifts the physiological demands. Because going clockwise means these runners are facing severe, just aggressively steep climbs almost immediately out of the gate.
So the penalty is super front-loaded.
Exactly. But, if they survive that initial onslaught, they get rewarded with much longer, arguably more runnable descents in the back half.
Right.
Plus, we've got current reports from the San Juan saying the course is largely snow-free this year.
Which is huge.
It is. It eliminates that brutal post-holing that usually just shreds your quadriceps. So we're honestly looking at a scenario primed for some blazingly fast times.
And waiting for them at the end of those fast times is probably one of the most unusual finish lines in all of sports.
Oh, the rock.
Yeah, there's no tape to break. A finisher officially stops the clock by literally kissing the Hardrock.
It's so iconic.
It really is. It's this large block of stone mining debris, and it's painted with the ram's head, just sitting right there in the middle of town.
I love it. And the storylines pushing these athletes to that rock this year are just phenomenal.
Oh, completely.
Like, on the men's side, you've got Ludo Pomeray. He is 50 years old, and he is hunting his third straight win.
And he already holds the course record, right?
He does. And his taper strategy, it included running these soft rock loops out of the back of his car. And then he jumped into a local 4th of July 5K dressed entirely in a rooster costume.
Wait, a rooster costume?
A full rooster costume.
That is incredible.
It's amazing. Then, you look at Tom Evans, who comes into this having already conquered Western States and UTMB.
Right, which is no small feat.
If he takes the win in Silverton, he joins this elite list of only 3 people in history to win all 4 of the sport's most iconic hundreds.
And what's crazy about Tom is that he lives at sea level in the UK.
Oh, right. So how did he even prep for this?
Well, he essentially engineered his body for it by spending months doing these punishing high-incline treadmill intervals inside a hypoxic altitude tent.
Wow. Just manufacturing the mountain in his house?
Exactly. And then Arlen Glick is also lurking in that men's field, representing just a phenomenal case study in biological resilience.
Right, the comeback story.
Yeah. He underwent major surgery, systematically rebuilt his entire musculoskeletal system, secured a 4th-place finish here in 2023, and now he is back for more.
But, the women's field is really what brings us to the actual mission of this deep dive today.
Definitely.
Look at Tara Dower. She is starting Hardrock a mere 13 days after finishing Western States.
Just 13 days. It's hard to even comprehend.
It really is. And Courtney Dauwalter is towing the line just 65 days out from the Cocodona 250-mile. So we have a massive stack of sources on the desk today, peer-reviewed medical journals, research papers on ultra-endurance physiology, clinical field notes.
We're getting deep into it.
Yeah, our mission is to unpack the absolute extremes of human endurance. We want to know what a 100-mile race actually costs: the heart, the muscular chassis, the gut, and the brain.
Right, the real biological toll.
Exactly. And most importantly, how do these athletes engineer their recovery so they can subject their bodies to this trauma again and again?
Well, to really understand that physiological trauma, we first have to sort of deconstruct the cognitive framing that allows an athlete to willingly initiate it in the first place.
Because, every biological alarm bell has to be ringing.
Oh, absolutely. Usually around mile 60, the physical training becomes almost irrelevant if the psychological toolkit fails. We really need to examine the linguistic strategies these elite runners deploy to just override their own central nervous systems.
So, if the brain's primary job is self-preservation and the body is actively breaking down, that internal monologue has to be chaotic, right? Like, how do they manipulate that narrative to stop the brain from hitting the kill switch?
It's fascinating. The clinical research on the cognitive strategies of elite ultrarunners isolates a very specific shift in self-talk during peak suffering.
Okay, what kind of shift?
Well, in the absolute darkest moments, the athletes actively discard first-person pronouns.
Wait, really?
Yeah, they stop thinking, I am dying, I cannot take another step. Instead, they forcefully pivot to second or third person linguistics. They'll say things like, you are moving well, or she has plenty of fuel left.
Oh, wow. So they are essentially manufacturing an external pacer inside their own head.
Precisely.
By removing the I, they distance their core identity from the physical sensation of pain. It becomes this thing happening to a vessel they are managing rather than something they're personally enduring.
Exactly. It fundamentally limits the threat appraisal.
Which makes sense. I mean, is this why chunking the race, focusing purely on the 3 miles to the next aid station rather than the 40 miles to the finish is so ubiquitous?
That's exactly why. You are narrowing the cognitive load so the brain doesn't have to process the totality of the physical threat. The brain completely panics when confronted with 40 miles of impending tissue damage.
Right. It just says starve.
Yeah, but it can rationally manage the concept of moving forward for 45 minutes to reach a cup of broth.
That's such a brilliant trick.
It is. But this psychological armor, it's forged through a very specific relationship with failure.
How so?
The literature indicates that for these athletes, major performance breakthroughs almost exclusively follow their most spectacular physical collapses.
Interesting.
Yeah, elite runners do not engage in, toxic positivity. They actually engage in negative visualization.
Oh, like preparing for the worst.
Exactly. They spend their taper weeks vividly imagining the profound misery of late-stage aid stations. They anticipate the nausea, the dead legs, the cold.
So that when the physiological crisis inevitably arrives, it triggers a rehearsed protocol rather than blind panic.
Right. They basically pre-suffer. So the real suffering feels familiar, almost scheduled.
That's incredible. But, psychological framing alone can't sustain a human for 48 hours. There has to be a biological reward pathway overriding the pain signals.
Oh, for sure.
We constantly hear the term runner's high tossed around, and it's usually attributed to endorphins just flooding the system. Isn't endorphin rush actually what keeps someone locked into a 100-mile sufferfest?
So this is a huge misconception. The scientific consensus has completely moved away from the endorphin hypothesis.
Really? No endorphins?
Well, the body absolutely produces endorphins under heavy physical stress. But endorphins are structurally massive molecules.
Okay.
They're simply too large to pass through the blood-brain barrier, so they remain in the bloodstream, entirely incapable of interacting with the brain's neurological receptors to produce any kind of euphoria.
Wow. Okay, so if it's not endorphins, what is it?
The phenomenon we actually call the runner's high is driven by endocannabinoids.
Wait, endocannabinoids. We are talking about the body producing its own endogenous version of cannabis.
Precisely. Endocannabinoids like anandamide, which is often referred to as the bliss molecule, are these lipid-based neurotransmitters naturally synthesized by your body during prolonged aerobic exertion.
Then because they're lipid-based.
Because they're lipid-soluble, they slip right through the blood-brain barrier with zero resistance.
Unbelievable.
And once they are inside the brain, they bind to the exact same CB1 and CB2 receptors that the active compounds in cannabis target.
Oh my God.
Yeah, and this binding actively dampens the transmission of pain signals in the descending inhibitory pathways, and it induces this profound sort of floating euphoria.
That is wild. The human body essentially operates an internal, highly regulated dispensary designed to keep us moving.
Pretty much. It's an evolutionary survival mechanism for running down prey for days.
But, deploying that survival mechanism for recreation introduces a highly volatile edge to the sport, doesn't it? If the brain is continually flooded with endocannabinoids, we are looking at the biological foundation for addiction.
You hit the nail on the head. The clinical data completely confirms that vulnerability. There's a really sobering epidemiological statistic that highlights that roughly 1 in 5 ultrarunners screens positive for exercise addiction risk.
1 in 5.
Yeah. And when you contextualize that against the general population, where the risk sits at a mere 0.5%, The disparity is staggering.
And the danger has got to be deeply camouflaged by the sport's requirements, right? Because to survive a 100-miler, you must possess exceptionally high emotional stability and just a monolithic pain tolerance.
Absolutely.
So if a highly emotionally stable person becomes addicted, their compulsion doesn't manifest as a chaotic, visible downward spiral. It masquerades as extreme, admirable discipline.
That's the scariest part.
Right. They wake up at 3 a.m. to run 20 miles before work, and society just applauds their grit. We completely miss the fact that they are systematically overriding physical warning signals they desperately need to heed.
Exactly. The very traits that guarantee a finish buckle the athlete into a dangerous psychological loop. They leverage their pain tolerance to ignore structural damage, which just feeds the compulsion.
Right.
But we must, of course, contextualize this by noting that for a significant percentage of the ultra-running population, this extreme physical channel actually serves as a highly effective, neurologically protective pathway out of other, vastly more destructive chemical or behavioral addictions.
So for many, the trail actually becomes the management system.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so the psychology gets them to the starting line and provides the neurological anesthetic to keep them moving. But let's define the physiological battlefield they're actually stepping onto once the gun fires and those endocannabinoids kick in.
Let's do it.
We are tracking a biological system attempting to survive a multi-day crisis.
Right. And to frame the sheer scale of the crisis, we have to recognize that the term ultramarathon is a wildly broad umbrella.
It really is.
It denotes anything beyond 26.2 miles, but the physiological demands of a 50-miler versus a mountain 100-miler like Hardrock or a multi-day 6-day track race, they're entirely different environments.
But they all share a common baseline of stress.
They do. Regardless of the distance, the moment the race begins, the athlete initiates a massive, simultaneous physiological cascade.
Break that cascade down for us. What's happening all at once?
So the body is suddenly tasked with managing severe hepatic and muscle glycogen depletion. At the same time, there is extensive structural damage to the muscle fibers. You've got profound intracellular and extracellular fluid shifts.
Wow.
Yeah, plus a widespread systemic immune response and a heavily compromised gastrointestinal barrier. All of these critical system alarms are firing concurrently, without pause, for hours or days.
I always look at the ultrarunner's body in the late stages of a race as a sinking naval ship.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
Yeah, like the crew is in absolute chaos. One team is furiously bailing out water to manage the fluid shifts. Another team is trying to extinguish electrical fires caused by the systemic inflammation.
Right.
And then a third team is attempting to patch massive structural holes in the hull from the muscle breakdown. And the entire time, if the crew in the engine room stops shoveling coal into the furnace, the pumps lose power and the ship goes down instantly.
That is exactly it. And the coal in your analogy is carbohydrate availability.
The fuel.
Yes, and the literature is unequivocal on this point. Exogenous carbohydrate oxidation is the central linchpin of endurance survival.
Because it drives the muscles.
It dictates the mechanical energy output of the working muscle, sure. But more critically, it governs the integrity of the gut lining and the magnitude of the immune response.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize it controlled the immune response, too.
It does. If carbohydrate availability drops below a critical threshold, the entire physiological operation collapses.
Okay, so if carbohydrates are the coal, the human heart is the engine room continuously driving the pumps.
Absolutely.
What is the structural cost to the myocardium when you force it to maintain a high cardiac output for 50 to 100 miles, particularly when navigating the 33,000 feet of climbing at Hardrock?
It's intense. The cardiovascular cost manifests as a condition defined in the literature as exercise-induced cardiac fatigue.
Cardiac fatigue.
Yeah. When you monitor cardiac function via echocardiography during an ultra, you observe distinct architectural shifts after roughly 5 to 7 hours of extreme, continuous exertion.
Wait, architectural shifts, the heart actually changes shape.
It does. The right ventricle specifically begins to dilate. It physically stretches out.
Oh my God.
And as the myocardium overstretches, it loses its contractility, which is its ability to forcefully eject blood into the pulmonary artery. Consequently, the ejection fraction measurably drops.
Why is the right ventricle taking the brunt of the damage rather than the left?
Well, the right ventricle has a much thinner muscular wall than the left ventricle, and it is responsible for pumping deoxygenated blood through the lungs. During heavy exertion, especially at the 12,000-foot altitudes of the San Juan Mountains, pulmonary vascular resistance spikes dramatically.
So there's more resistance pushing back.
Exactly. The thinner right ventricle is suddenly forced to pump significantly harder against a much higher pressure gradient, which leads directly to that dilation and fatigue.
If the cardiac tissue is stretching and fatiguing to that degree, the cellular membranes must be compromising. Does this structural stress show up in post-race blood panels?
It does, and honestly, the data often alarms clinicians who are unfamiliar with endurance physiology.
What do they see?
If you draw blood from an ultrarunner at the finish line, you routinely see highly elevated levels of troponin.
Troponin, right.
Yeah, and in a standard emergency room setting, a sudden spike in cardiac troponin is the definitive diagnostic biomarker for an acute myocardial infarction.
Wait, a heart attack?
Yes.
So on paper, these runners are systematically giving themselves controlled micro-heart attacks across 100 miles.
Well, no, let's frame that carefully. We have to strictly frame this within the context of recovery and adaptation.
Okay, clarify that for me.
While the biomarker mimics an acute infarction, the mechanism of release is entirely different.
How so?
In a heart attack, the troponin leaks because the cardiac cells are dying from localized oxygen starvation.
But in the runner?
In the ultrarunner, the troponin leaks because the cellular membranes have become highly permeable under the sheer mechanical stress of prolonged volume overload.
Ah, so they aren't dying, just stretching and leaking.
Exactly. And this acute cardiac fatigue is remarkably transient. With absolute rest, the right ventricle remodels back to its baseline geometry, contractility normalizes, and the troponin clears from the bloodstream within a few days. The heart demonstrates just staggering resilience.
That's incredible, but the key variable there is absolute rest.
Yes.
But if we look at the modern ultra calendar, elite athletes are frequently racing multiple 100-milers in a single season. I mean, Tara Dower is racing Hardrock 13 days after Western States. If the heart requires days or weeks to fully restore that membrane integrity, what happens when athletes continually deny the engine room the necessary repair window?
That introduces the most pressing concern in longitudinal sports cardiology.
The long-term effects.
Exactly. The long-term literature strongly cautions that athletes racing at the extreme end of the volume spectrum, without strategic, prolonged recovery windows, they really risk permanent, chronic cardiac remodeling.
Like scarring.
Yes. Over decades, this relentless cycle of dilation and inadequate repair can lead to myocardial fibrosis, which is microscopic scarring of the heart tissue.
Wow.
The heart will adapt and rebuild stronger, but only if the athlete actually respects the biological timeline required for tissue regeneration.
So the engine room survives if you let it rest.
That's the rule.
Okay, moving outward from the heart, we have to look at the chassis, the skeletal muscle system, absorbing the eccentric load of a 100-mile mountain race.
The beating it takes is just astronomical.
I can't even imagine. Every foot strike on those 33,000 feet of descent at Hardrock is microscopically tearing the quadriceps apart. When we look at the inflammatory biomarkers post-race, what is the scale of the damage?
The systemic inflammatory response following an ultra literally mimics major physical trauma.
Like a car crash.
Practically, yeah. We track 3 primary biomarkers to quantify this.
What are they?
First is creatine. This is a specific intracellular enzyme that spills into the bloodstream only when the structural integrity of the muscle fiber's sarcomere is compromised by mechanical tearing.
Okay, so creatine equals torn muscles.
Right. Second, we see massive upregulations in interleukin-6, or IL-6, which is an inflammatory cytokine acting as a signaling molecule.
And the third?
Finally, we measure CRP, C-reactive protein. This is synthesized by the liver in response to the IL-6, and it serves as the definitive marker of widespread systemic inflammation.
Okay, so that cocktail of creatine, IL-6, and CRP, it doesn't just evaporate when the athlete kisses the rock in Silverton.
Oh, definitely not.
It circulates for days or weeks. So if we look at the phenomenon of dead legs, where a runner tries to jog 2 weeks after a race, they feel zero acute muscle soreness, but their legs just refuse to generate power. Is that lingering systemic inflammation the culprit?
It is the exact mechanism.
Really?
Yes. The structural muscle tears may have largely healed, which removes the sensation of acute soreness, but the systemic inflammatory noise remains incredibly high.
So what does that noise do?
This persistent inflammation directly interferes with afferent feedback loops in the central nervous system, creating profound neuromuscular fatigue.
Wait, so it's a brain issue?
Exactly.
Yeah.
The brain literally cannot effectively recruit the motor units required to fire the muscle fibers because the neural pathways are heavily suppressed by the inflammatory environment.
Wow. It's like the signal is just getting lost in the static.
Precisely.
Now, a common refrain from anyone outside the sport looking at this level of structural damage is the assumption of joint destruction.
Oh, I hear this constantly.
Right. The immediate assumption is that running 100 miles through mountains will inevitably obliterate the cartilage in your knees.
And it's completely wrong. The clinical research categorically debunks the myth of joint destruction.
Okay, break that down for me because people are going to want to hear this.
Longitudinal imaging studies on lifetime ultra-endurance athletes demonstrate that regular running is actively protective of joint health.
Protective.
Yes. The intermittent hydrostatic pressure exerted on the knee joint during the running gait cycle acts as a pump. It drives synovial fluid deep into the avascular cartilage, feeding the tissue and actually promoting adaptation.
So it's essentially oiling the machine.
Exactly. The skeletal muscles, tendons, and fascia take the overwhelming brunt of the eccentric damage, not the articular cartilage.
That completely flips the mainstream narrative.
It really does.
But knowing the joints are adapting, but the muscles are shredded and swimming in an inflammatory soup, we have to critically evaluate how athletes manage that repair window.
This is a huge point of contention.
Because the aid station culture is deeply reliant on over-the-counter NSAIDs, runners treat ibuprofen as a preventative tool, consuming it to blunt the pain and inflammation so they can keep moving.
Which is a terrible idea.
Right. If inflammation is the necessary biological signal to rebuild the tissue, taking an NSAID is the physiological equivalent of turning off the smoke alarm while your house is actively burning down.
That is a perfect analogy. It is a devastatingly counterproductive strategy, and it's heavily discouraged by the current medical literature.
What exactly is the NSAID doing biologically?
Well, by consuming NSAIDs, you are chemically inhibiting the cyclooxygenase pathways, specifically COX-1 and COX-2,
Okay.
which blunts the synthesis of prostaglandins.
And prostaglandins do what?
They are the messengers that signal for repair. So
Yeah.
you temporarily mute the pain, sure, but you simultaneously silence the exact inflammatory signals the body desperately requires to initiate muscle satellite cell proliferation and tissue repair.
So you're trading long-term healing for short-term comfort.
Exactly. You are mortgaging your long-term recovery for a few hours of acute pain relief.
And the risk profile during the race itself goes far beyond delayed muscle repair, right? You have a dehydrated athlete constantly sweating, experiencing massive fluid shifts, and then they introduce a drug that actively restricts blood flow to the kidneys.
And that is the more acute clinical danger.
How bad can it get?
NSAIDs constrict the afferent arterioles in the kidneys. When an ultra runner is already hypovolemic from severe dehydration, renal blood flow is already deeply compromised.
Because there's just less fluid to pump around.
Right. So introducing an NSAID into that specific environment drastically elevates the risk of acute kidney injury, up to and including complete renal failure.
That is terrifying.
It is a profound physiological risk taken for a really negligible performance reward.
Okay, so the muscles can be shattered, the heart can be fatigued, and the runner can still drag themselves forward. But if the gastrointestinal system collapses, forward momentum ceases entirely. Severe nausea and the inability to process fuel remain the leading cause of a DNF, right? Did not finish.
Yeah, the gut is the ultimate arbiter of a 100-miler.
So why does an iron-stomached athlete suddenly find themselves violently rejecting a simple carbohydrate gel at mile 60?
The physiological mechanism driving that gastrointestinal revolt is called splanchnic hypoperfusion.
Splanchnic hypoperfusion. Okay, what does that mean?
So splanchnic refers to the vascular bed supplying the internal abdominal organs, and hypoperfusion signifies a critical reduction in blood flow.
Okay.
At rest, the gut receives roughly 20% of your cardiac output. However, during prolonged high-intensity exercise, the central nervous system has to triage its limited resources.
It has to prioritize.
Right, so it initiates massive vasoconstriction in the splanchnic bed. It violently redirects that blood flow away from the stomach and shunts it outward to the working skeletal muscles for oxygen delivery and to the skin for thermoregulation.
So the gut is actively suffocating. The very organ required to process the fuel necessary to sustain the effort is being starved of oxygen and blood flow.
Exactly. And this ischemic state triggers just a disastrous cascade.
Walk me through it.
As the intestinal epithelial cells are starved of oxygen and ATP, the tight junction proteins, specifically occludin and claudin, which seal the gaps between the cells they begin to denature and pull apart.
Oh, so the barrier literally breaks down.
Yes, the intestinal barrier becomes highly permeable. Pathogens and endotoxins that are normally confined safely to the gut lumen suddenly leak directly into the systemic circulation.
Which causes the nausea.
Yes, it triggers a massive immune response that manifests clinically as profound, unrelenting nausea. Furthermore, when the Hardrock runners hit the exposed climbs in the heat of the day, thermoregulatory demands skyrocket.
Which forces even more blood to the skin.
Exactly, which exponentially worsens the splenic ischemia.
Okay, but if the gut is highly permeable and blood flow is virtually non-existent, how do elite athletes successfully ingest 90 to 120 grams of carbohydrates an hour without violently rejecting it?
The clinical data reveals a fascinating adaptation. Maintaining a high rate of continuous caloric and carbohydrate intake during the race actually actively preserves intestinal blood flow and heavily reduces those injury markers.
Wait, so eating more actually saves the gut?
Paradoxically, yes. However, attempting that volume of intake without specific long-term preparation guarantees failure. The gut must be mechanically and chemically trained months in advance.
That training.
Yes, athletes must aggressively feed during their hardest, longest training sessions to upregulate the specific intestinal transporters,
Like what?
like SGLT1 for glucose and GLUT5 for fructose. By doing this, they increase both gastric emptying rates and overall absorptive capacity. You basically build the physiological infrastructure in training so it survives the ischemic stress on race day.
Which introduces really the cruelest irony of endurance physiology.
Oh, the post-race window.
Right. During the race, the athlete spends 24 hours force-feeding a suffocating stomach. And then the moment they cross the finish line, their body has accumulated a massive caloric deficit. The muscles are starving for glycogen synthesis.
And the gut responds by entirely suppressing the appetite.
Yes. The thought of eating a slice of pizza induces profound nausea. The biological demand for fuel is at its absolute peak, yet the drive to eat is completely offline.
The post-race hormonal milieu heavily suppresses the hunger signaling pathways. But this is where the athlete must execute deliberate mechanical eating.
Eating even when they feel sick.
Yes, the post-race recovery window requires immediate, aggressive nutritional intervention entirely divorced from the sensation of hunger.
What happens if they don't eat?
If the athlete waits for their appetite to return, they completely stall the clearance of the CRP and creatine circulating in their bloodstream. This drastically extends the inflammatory timeline and delays muscular repair.
So we have mapped the structural degradation of the chassis and the collapse of the fuel processing plant. Eventually, this widespread physical exhaustion breaches the blood-brain barrier.
The brain can only hold out for so long.
Exactly. When athletes push into the second night of a race like Hardrock, the neurological architecture begins to severely fragment. Let's examine the descent into sleep deprivation.
The research on sleep deprivation in ultra-endurance settings highlights a very critical timeline.
What's the window?
Profound neurological disruptions, primarily vivid, visual, and auditory hallucinations, reliably onset between 24 and 48 hours of continuous wakefulness.
Which is perfectly aligned with the race.
Right. The Hardrock 100 cutoff is precisely 48 hours, meaning the vast majority of the field will push their brains directly into the center of that hallucinatory window.
And what about the 200-milers?
Oh, when you examine the 200-plus mile distance, where athletes are awake for 70 to 90 hours, the compounding neurological decay is just astonishing.
So what is actually occurring in the brain circuitry to produce a state where a runner looks at a tree stump and genuinely perceives a person sitting in a chair offering them coffee?
A landmark study observing athletes navigating the Suffolk Backyard Ultra provided immense clarity on this cognitive degradation.
What'd they find?
The researchers tracked the athletes via rigorous psychomotor vigilance tasks and executive function tests. As the hours accumulated, the athletes experienced profound cognitive impairment.
Like slowed reflexes.
Exactly. Reaction times plummeted, subjective vigor scores flatlined, and the prefrontal cortex struggled to maintain basic logical processing.
But why the hallucinations specifically?
The hallucinations occur because the brain, which is just desperate for restoration, begins experiencing severe microsleeps.
Oh, so they are actually dreaming while awake.
Yes. The neurological boundary between the waking state and the REM dream state essentially dissolves. The brain is attempting to process external visual stimuli through the highly chaotic, uninhibited lens of a dream state.
which results in a tree stump being seamlessly processed as a human figure.
Exactly.
Knowing the central nervous system is on a strict biological countdown to failure, what are the strategic countermeasures? How do athletes build neurological resilience before the race, and how do they manage the decay during it?
The intervention begins weeks before the starting gun with ruthless sleep hygiene.
Ruthless sleep hygiene, like what?
The goal is to maximize the quality of the sleep architecture. Athletes must mandate a 2-hour buffer devoid of blue light from screens before bed to ensure natural melatonin production.
Okay, no phones.
Right. And the sleep environment must be regulated between 60 and 70 degrees to facilitate the drop in core body temperature necessary for deep sleep.
That makes sense.
Additionally, caffeine and alcohol intake must be heavily curtailed, as both severely disrupt the transition into slow-wave restorative sleep.
A common tactic I hear about is sleep banking, attempting to sleep 9 or 10 hours a night during race week. Does accumulating that surplus actually prevent the cognitive collapse when you are 30 hours deep into a race?
Pre-race sleep banking does not permanently inoculate the brain against sleep deprivation. The biological drive for sleep will eventually overpower any surplus you build up.
So it's not a cure.
No, but heavily extending sleep duration in the week prior significantly delays the onset of those severe cognitive impairments. It builds a robust neurological buffer.
And what about during the race itself?
Once the race begins, the strategy shifts entirely to managing the decay via strategic napping. The field data strongly supports power naps limited strictly to 15 or 20 minutes.
Okay, wait. If an athlete is severely sleep deprived and finally sits down in an aid station cot, why aggressively wake them after 15 minutes? Why not let the brain repair itself for a full hour?
Because if an athlete sleeps longer than 20 minutes, the brain transitions out of the lighter stage 1 and stage 2 sleep, and it descends into deep, slow-wave sleep.
And why is that bad during a race?
If the crew forcefully wakes the runner during that slow-wave phase, the athlete experiences profound sleep inertia.
Sleep inertia, like feeling super groggy.
Way worse. They wake up heavily disoriented, cognitively impaired, and battling a profound grogginess that can take hours to neurologically clear.
So it actually ruins their race.
Exactly. A 15-minute nap limits the brain to light sleep, providing a vital refresh of executive function without triggering the devastating hangover of sleep inertia.
And is there an optimal time for these naps?
Yes, the timing is critical. Athletes must target the 2 a.m. to 6 a.m. window. This represents the body's natural circadian low point, where core body temperature bottoms out and the biological drive to sleep is overwhelmingly potent. Napping during this window yields the highest cognitive return on investment.
That brings us to the most vital, yet often overlooked dynamic of ultra-endurance racing, the crew and the pacers.
They are everything.
Truly. Because if an athlete is 35 hours into a race, their legs might be executing the biomechanics perfectly, but their brain is functionally detached from reality. A crew isn't just carrying extra water bottles. They must actively serve as a cognitive safety net.
The crew literally functions as the runner's outsourced prefrontal cortex.
I love that phrasing.
It's true. As the runner's executive function degrades, the crew must aggressively assume responsibility for complex cognitive tasks.
Give me some examples.
Well, a sleep-deprived brain is entirely incapable of calculating required carbohydrate intake per hour based on changing heat conditions. So the crew manages the fueling math.
Makes sense.
And a sleep-deprived brain cannot rapidly assess technical terrain or calculate the risk of a snow crossing. The pacer makes those safety decisions.
So they are constantly evaluating.
Yes. The crew must constantly probe the runner's orientation, asking them to identify their location and time of day, monitoring the severity of the cognitive decay.
We have meticulously mapped the physiological destruction, the fatigued myocardium, the systemic inflammatory storm, the ischemic gut, and the fragmented neural pathways.
It's a lot of damage.
It is. And this brings us back to the psychological foundation we established at the beginning.
The why?
Exactly. How does an athlete objectively evaluate the line between pushing through immense pain for profound personal growth versus punishing themselves out of an unrecognized, unhealthy compulsion?
The evaluation rests entirely on the conscious reframing of pain and the integration of psychosocial dynamics.
What do you mean by psychosocial dynamics?
Well, endurance outcomes are rarely dictated purely by mechanical limits. They are governed by the perception of effort. It is not strictly about the volume of damage the muscles are sustaining, but rather how the central nervous system interprets that damage.
Okay, is there data on that interpretation?
There's a brilliant clinical study tracking an all-female 6-day ultramarathon that illuminated this exact dynamic.
6 days of continuous movement. How did the central nervous system process that sustained level of threat without triggering a complete shutdown?
The researchers documented a profound psychological shift as the race progressed and the physical breakdown became severe. The athletes consciously stopped processing the pain as an isolated individual problem they had to individually conquer.
So they stopped fighting it alone.
Exactly. They reframed the pain as a collective, shared experience of suffering. By leaning into team dynamics and social support, they altered the brain's threat appraisal.
Wow.
The pain remained intense, sure, but it was no longer interpreted by the brain as an isolated threat to survival. They stopped fighting the pain individually and began carrying it collectively. And if you want to go deeper on how these psychological and physiological patterns specifically play out for female athletes across hormonal life stages, our She's Built different series is built exactly for that.
I highly recommend checking that out. That reframing is powerful, but, it requires a level of self-awareness that can easily erode over a long season.
It really can.
I view the ultra-runner's mindset like a highly tuned stringed instrument. If you wind a guitar string to maximum tension and leave it there year-round, never loosening the pegs, the neck of the guitar will inevitably warp or the string will violently snap.
That is exactly what happens with overtraining.
Right. Athletes must advocate for aggressive mental periodization. The annual check-in is mandatory. You must sit down in the off-season and ruthlessly ask yourself, is this sport genuinely serving my life, expanding my capabilities, and bringing me joy? Or am I systematically reorganizing my career, my family, and my health just to accommodate the mileage?
It's a hard conversation to have with yourself.
Very hard. Taking a true off-season, where you entirely detach from structured training, is a deeply strategic necessity. It's not a display of weakness.
Mental restoration is the prerequisite for physical adaptation. Without the cognitive break, the central nervous system remains highly sensitized, and the risk of overtraining syndrome skyrockets.
Which transitions us directly into the payoff section of this deep dive. We have spent the last hour diagnosing the immense damage inflicted on the human machine. Let's construct the absolute blueprint for recovering from it.
The most important part.
Definitely. How does an athlete actually earn their longevity in this sport? When the Hardrock runners kiss the rock and stop their watches, what is the exact physiological action plan for the days following a 100-mile effort?
The recovery blueprint is dictated by biological half-lives, not calendars. Let's analyze days 1 through 3 immediately following the race.
What's the protocol for those first 3 days?
The sole biological objective is the clearance of the inflammatory biomarkers we discussed earlier, CRP and creatine.
Okay, so how do they clear them?
The agenda for the athlete is absolute, unapologetic rest, plus aggressive rehydration to restore plasma volume, extreme sleep extension to facilitate human growth hormone release, and massive continuous carbohydrate loading to replenish profoundly depleted hepatic and muscle glycogen stores.
And what about painkillers?
During the 72-hour window, the ban on NSAIDs is absolute.
Absolute.
Yes. The inflammatory signals must be allowed to peak and initiate the repair sequence.
So the sole job is to eat, sleep, and allow the biological systems to clear the wreckage.
Precisely. Now, as we transition into days 4 through 7, the protocol shifts to active recovery exclusively.
Active recovery, like what?
This involves light, non-impact movement, gentle walking, or a low-resistance spin on a stationary bike. It's designed purely to promote blood flow and flush metabolic waste.
So no running.
There must be zero loaded, eccentric running during this entire first week. The structural tears in the muscle fibers are still actively regenerating, and the neuromuscular pathways are still heavily suppressed by lingering inflammation.
This is exactly where the rigid adherence to a training plan destroys longevity. Runners are habitually obsessed with arbitrary calendar dates.
Oh, completely.
They look at a spreadsheet and dictate, it has been exactly 8 days since the race, therefore I must run 6 miles today. The cellular biology of the human body has zero concept of a Tuesday.
Right. The body doesn't own a calendar.
So what are the specific, objective, physiological green lights an athlete must observe before they subject their body to training stress again?
The decision to resume training must be governed by biometric data and subjective baseline markers. There are 5 green lights.
Walk us through them. What's the first one?
The first mandatory green light is the normalization of sleep architecture. The athlete is no longer experiencing night sweats, and they are successfully entering deep, slow-wave sleep without disruption.
Okay, check. What's the second?
The second green light is the resting heart rate returning to its precise pre-race baseline. An elevated resting heart rate is a glaring indicator that the sympathetic nervous system is still heavily activated, managing unhealed trauma.
That's a huge one. And the third?
The third green light requires observing a steady, sustained upward trend in HRV heart rate variability, indicating that the parasympathetic nervous system has successfully regained control of the autonomic balance.
Okay, so that's sleep, resting heart rate, and HRV. What about the psychological and hormonal markers?
The fourth green light is a stabilization of mood. Yes, the profound depletion of neurotransmitters like dopamine and serotonin post-race routinely triggers acute depressive episodes. The athlete must wait until that neurochemical fog fully lifts and intrinsic motivation returns.
That post-race depression is so real.
It really is. And the final critical green light is the return of genuine, robust hunger. This signals that the gastrointestinal system has fully healed and the endocrine system is correctly signaling energy demands.
So you have to hit all five.
Exactly. When all five of those complex physiological metrics align, the body has granted permission to train.
Managing that matrix of biometric data post-race is where something like FitPA becomes the ultimate recovery tool.
It takes the guesswork out of it entirely.
It does. It connects seamlessly to your Garmin or Coros watch, reading every single metric, your sleep architecture, your resting heart rate, your HRV trends, and it tracks exactly how your body's responding to the trauma. It doesn't care what arbitrary date is on the calendar.
Yeah, it looks at the biology.
Exactly. After a massive systemic shock like a 100-miler, FitPA synthesizes your actual biological data to tell you precisely when your fitness and recovery metrics indicate you are physically capable of absorbing training stress again.
Which is so crucial.
And the AI coach builds a dynamic plan around your specific race goals and your current actual fitness level. Most importantly, it instantly adapts when life, sleep, or recovery doesn't go to plan. Following a 100-miler or a 200-miler, the recovery timeline rarely follows a linear spreadsheet.
Almost never.
If you want a system that objectively reads your data and adjusts your training when your body genuinely demands rest, that is exactly what FitPA is engineered for. And right now, it is entirely free. If you join during the Pro Early Access window, you lock in the Pro features for free permanently.
Having an objective, data-driven system to intercept the emotional drive to overtrain is just invaluable for long-term survival in this sport.
Absolutely.
As we close this deep dive into the extremes of human endurance, I want to leave you with a final philosophical provocation to mull over.
Let's hear it.
We have spent an hour meticulously documenting how this sport stretches and fatigues the architecture of the heart, how it starves the gastrointestinal system of oxygen until it fails, and how it pushes the central nervous system so far past its biological limits that reality fragments into hallucinations.
It's a grim picture.
It is. Knowing the absolute certainty of that profound physical destruction, we have to ask, is the true allure of ultrarunning genuinely about the pursuit of physical fitness?
Probably not.
Or is it, fundamentally, about the pursuit of a highly specific, profound clarity? A singular state of existence that can only be achieved when every superficial worry, every pending email, and every minor stressor in your modern life is entirely, utterly burned away by the consuming fire of absolute physical exhaustion.
I think anyone tracking those runners coming out of Silverton this morning knows the exact answer to that. Keep an eye on those splits today. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.